Okay, so today we're going to look at neurons and how they actually work. We'll look at quickly at some motor and sensory neurons, and then we'll look at an action potential and how information is actually passed from one neuron to the next. So this occurs both in the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. And every single neuron, depending on whether it's, or even if it's in the peripheral or the central nervous system, all consist of a soma, some dendrites, and the axon, and that's how the information is actually passed from neuron to neuron to get messages up to the brain and also messages back down. So the first thing we'll look at is the soma. So I think I mentioned that briefly in the last educations that I did. So it's the central part of the neuron, so you can see the soma here. It's pointing down to this part here. It's in the very, very middle, and it's very potassium rich. And if you recall last year when we did the digestive system, and we talked a lot about potassium and sodium and how important those two particular ions are for our nerve impulses to be carried from place to place. And a lot of this stuff you can get, especially sodium and potassium, from your diet, and that will also increase and make the nervous impulses much more efficient if we have correct diet as well. The organelles are all the same in the neuron as they are in other parts of the body or other cells of the body. So you're going to find mitochondria, you're going to find ribosomes, all those same organelles. They may be in different amounts, but they're all there as well. So you can see how they function. So the next one we'll look at is the axon. So this begins with an axon hillock. I'm just trying to see if I can find a picture of it on here for you. Let me change colour. Okay. So that is this section there. So that's the beginning of it. And the protein composition of the axon membrane is a little different from that of the soma membrane. So there's actually no ribosomes in there. So all the protein, this is in the axon, sorry. So all the protein needs to be made in the soma where the ribosomes are, and that then transports protein into the axon hillock. So you can see the ribosomes up here, and they're contained within the soma, and then they pass on the proteins that are made by the ribosomes, down to the axon hillock. So they're less than a millimetre usually, but they're over a metre long, less than a millimetre to over a metre long, depending on where it actually is. So if we have small neurons, ones such as those in the brain, they're going to be tiny, but many of them. And if they're in other parts of the bodies where they need to reach further places, your arms down to your legs, they could be quite long. They could be up to a metre long. So you can see the difference there. So the next area we're going to look at is the axon terminal, and there's always three parts to the axon terminal. You've always got the beginning, which is the axon hillock, which we looked at in the last slide. Then we have the middle, which is the axon itself, and then we have the end, which is the axon terminal. That is this part right here. So that's the axon terminal. So those three are always there. So that terminal is where the axon comes into contact with other neurons, and that is where the information is passed on from one neuron to the next. So all this part here is the axon terminal, and that's one of the neurons. And this bit down here, let's change colour, is the next neuron. So the information is going to pass from that axon terminal down into the next neuron, and then that information will travel via that axon to the next part. Now the point of contact where that information is actually passed from one to the other, it's called a synapse. So in this section here, that's where the synapse will actually occur. And when that particular neuron makes synaptic contact with the other cell, it actually innervates the next cell, innervates that next cell to pass that information on to each cell after that. All right, so the synapse, let's have a little look more. Oh, sorry, I should also mention, I'm just going to go back there for a second. When we look at the axon terminal as well, it's full of mitochondria. It's got a ton of mitochondria, so I might put that here. And as you can imagine, if we're looking at passing messages via synapses, it needs to have a lot of energy. So that particular part of the neuron has a ton of mitochondria in there to produce the energy needed for that chemical synapse to actually occur. All right, so looking at the synapse now. So the axon terminals from synapses with dendrites or soma of other neurons, so it would terminate, sorry. So axon terminals will pass from one to the other. So I've got this same diagram here that I had on the last page, and you can see where that synapse occurs, but it happens in different sort of places in each different type of cell, and depending where the neurons are actually located in the body, they pass their information on in different sort of parts. So in this first diagram on this side, you can see right there, oops, I just drew over it, so now you can't see. I'm going to rub that out. So you can see where that little square is. Oh, darn it. There. That's where one of the synapses is occurring. But if we look at the next example, you can see it's in a different, where that synapse is going to occur is in a different location. And in the third example, we've got two neurons passing information on at the same time. So we've got this one here passing information onto this one here, which is then passing information onto this one here. So depending whereabouts in the brain and how fast we need to make those connections. So these ones you'll normally see or typically see in the brain where we have to make, very quick interpretations of information so we know how to act on that information. Okay, so that's basically, where synapses occur, and that's how we get all the information from one neuron to another. So when a nerve impulse arrives in the presynaptic axon, which is, change colour, there, okay, so when the nerve impulse arrives there, the neurotransmitter molecules are released from the synaptic vessel and into a synaptic cleft. So right here is the synaptic vessels. So that's on the next cell, the next neuron, and here is the synaptic cleft. So that's where the information arrives from the first cell or the first neuron to the next neuron. The neurotransmitter, which is the information that's being passed on, then binds to specific receptor proteins. Okay, so we've got receptor proteins that happen here. And you can see where the arrows are pointing to, those tiny little dots in there. They are receptor proteins that are inside that synaptic cleft. And what they actually do is produce electrical or chemical signals in the postsynaptic cell. So this one is the presynaptic cell, and this one is the postsynaptic cell. So this is the one giving the information, and this one here is the one receiving the information. So the electrical to chemical to electrical transformation, that's basically how our information is travelled. That makes it possible for our brain to carry out specific abilities or functions, and where we make improvements. So when we're making these new neural pathways that I've spoken about in class, learning to walk, learning to talk, movements, all that kind of thing, we make modifications. So the modifications of this process up here of how we pass information from one cell to the other is involved in things such as, memory and learning and all those sorts of things. And when we have a dysfunction in that process, so when the neurons find it quite difficult in the brain to pass that information chemically and electrically from cell to cell, that's when we get specific, mental disorders and that type of thing. I'm not going to talk too much about that because that's psychology, but that's why we have these sort of mental abnormalities. So the messages aren't being carried across properly from each one. And because of that, where that synapse occurs, so if we go back here again, where that synapse is actually occurring, that's the site of toxins. So if we have any sort of toxin, either self-induced that we've put into our bodies at all, like alcohol and that kind of thing, or you've got toxins, unfortunately you may have been, bitten by a spider or a snake or something like that. The toxin actually reacts because of that synapse. That's where the toxin's actually reacting on. And it's also the place where you get a lot of those psychoactive drugs. And when I talk about that, it's not just prescription, medications that act on the brain. It's also, and that could not just be for mental illness, by the way. It can be for things such as epilepsy and, other disorders as well. But people that take sort of recreational type drugs, amphetamine-based drugs, acts on that part of the brain, so where the synapse is actually occurring. So if we look at something like amphetamine, for example, its job basically is to speed up these chemical synapses that are occurring in the brain. So everything is heightened all the time, and that's why you get people, acting certain ways, or they're on these specific drugs. And I always lecture you about not ever taking the drug ice. That really acts and impacts on those synapses in the brain, and that's why people that become addicted to these drugs end up doing things and acting certain ways that the general population don't do, because they are completely changing the way that the neurons in their brain synapse and carry information from one part to the other. So it affects all sorts of things. Okay, so here's another closer look at some different synapses. So looking at this one here, again, commonly you will see examples of that in places where you've got to get that information to and from the brain really, really quickly, or you might see that in the actual brain, and you'll get this information passed along. If you need to do a multitude of different actions at once, you may have many messages sent to the brain. If you're reading and you're writing and you're talking, and you're fidgeting and you're doing all these things at once, you've got different parts of your brain being activated and these messages being sent there, consistently and at the same time. You can also see somewhere like here, which you may see these kinds of synapses occurring in muscle cells. So people that are, everyone has their, hopefully their muscle cells working, but if you were to contract your muscles, even if it's just to get up out of a chair and walk out the door, you have all these, synapses occurring that have these motor neurons sending information to the muscles all at once to be able to innervate those muscles so you can get up and walk around. So that's where you'll typically see one like that, where you get that carried, multiple synapses occurring at once to carry out specific information. So I have to talk quite quickly because there's only a half-hour limit on here, and I'm almost already halfway through. Okay, so let's look now at your dendrites, the dendrites on the cell. So here's the soma again. Let's just go back to here. So we've looked now at how those messages are carried across the synapse, but we need to get that information down to where that synapse is actually going to occur. And along the dendrites, which are all these little bits coming off here, there are thousands and thousands of synapses occurring. So wherever you see all these little bits coming off here, they have other neurons, whether motor or sensory or interneurons, basically, producing synapses with another neuron. So there's thousands of them on each neural cell. So it's covered with thousands of synapses, and they too have many, many proton molecules, and these molecules are called receptors. So we talked about the protein receptors, not on that one, back here. These receptors down the bottom here, they're the protein receptors. So they come off the dendrites, and they detect any neurotransmitters that come along in that synaptic cleft that we looked at before. So motor neurons, for example, if we were to look at, oops, I wrote motto. That's meant to say motor. Let's cross off a T and put an R. Motor neurons, that looks like a V. R, oh God, you know what I'm talking about. Motor. Neurons release, what was I saying? Oh yeah. They control voluntary movements. So they release a neurotransmitter called acetylcholine at synapses. And that is a very specific chemical that we have all through our muscular system and anywhere where there's motor neurons, and that is the chemical that's actually released at the synapses that allows our muscles to contract. Not just voluntary movement either, by the way, it's also muscle contractions as part of our involuntary nervous system that helps those to move as well. You've also got heaps of insulation, which we'll look at a little bit later, that cover these neurons. The Schwann cells that actually get carried. We'll look at that later. It's insulation to keep them protected. And the main ingredient, I guess, inside the neuron is water and something that we call cytosol. So again, if I can just go back onto my water lecture, we again need the water because it makes up these cells, it makes up these neurons, and if we don't have hydration, and it's not just to do with exercise, if you just need to think to get through the day, then you need water to help your neurons fire to function. So even if you're doing an exam or or anything really, you need to have that water in your system to keep your brain working properly. So it helps because they're electrically charged atoms there, which are ions, and they're dissolved in this water. So if we don't have the water, the hydration, especially because our brain needs it definitely, then those electrically charged atoms, they can't be dissolved with the ions. And they're responsible for our action potentials. So there you go. If I haven't convinced you enough when it was really hot earlier in the year to drink water, then hopefully this also helps you or want to drink a lot of water. All right, next, let's look at the action potential. So now we've looked at the neurons and how information is passed on. We need to look at the action potential. So this is fired every time we need to get information long distances in the body. Okay, so it's called an action potential, and it usually conveys information over long distances and is always within the nervous system. So there's a few different phases, and you can see them in the diagram at the bottom. You have a rising phase and a falling phase. So rising phase and a falling phase. So we're going to look at some of those and see basically how they actually work. So with the rising phase, you get a really rapid depolarization of the membrane. So looking back at some of the tiny little bit of biochemistry that we looked at last year, that rising phase depolarizes the cell or the membrane within that cell to allow the information to be passed from one to the other. And then that's that rising phase. And then that falling phase we have there of the action potential is a rapid repolarization. So then the membrane becomes more negative than the resting potential. So the resting potential is this bit and this bit. Okay, so all that's basically meaning when you see this big overshoot that's happening here, you've got an impulse. You might have heard of nerve impulses coming along, and that's what that actually is. Okay, so actual action potentials are so fast. So when there's no nerves, you'll get this sort of little resting potential here, but all of a sudden you get that message sent, then more resting potential, then message sent, more message sent. And they happen so fast, they usually only last about 2 milliseconds. That's how fast they are. So it lasts 2 milliseconds. Yeah, so they're pretty quick because we need to really get that information fast. So again, that's just what I spoke about before. I just got a bit ahead of myself. So it becomes repolarized, so the membrane is more negative, and the action potential lasts 2 milliseconds. Once that's passed, we'll no doubt get another one that comes along quite quickly. So we need to get constant information around our body all day. So when we look at action potentials, that's what's happening when we feel sharp pain. And the example I've got here, you can see this guy on the side's about to step on a thumbtack. Yep. So the perception of the sharp pain enters the skin, so it enters all our sensory nerves within the skin, and it's caused by a generation of an action potential. So once we feel that pain, the action potential begins in the nerve fibers that are in the skin down the bottom here. And that membrane possesses a gated sodium channel that opens when the nerve ending is stretched. I've got a diagram coming up to show you that happens. So you get this big influx of sodium and potassium ions that are rushing in and out of the nerve ending. That happens when it's stretched. So the sodium gated channel opens when it feels sharp pain. Yep. Okay. Good. So the order. Do I have that here? Yeah. The order of the action potential. So you've got something sharp that enters the skin. So in the example shown was the thumbtack. The membrane of the nerve fibers in the skin becomes stretched, and sodium permeable channels open because of a large concentration gradient. Yep, okay, so the entry of the sodium depolarizes the membrane, so the surface of the membrane becomes less negative. So here, if you look at the diagrams down there, you've got entry of sodium coming in, and if you go to this diagram here, you can see that potassium is flooding out. So we have sodium in, Na+, goes in, and sodium comes out. And they're the two ions that I spoke about last year in Year 11 when we looked at the biochemistry part in nutrition, that we actually need for our cells, our nerve cells, to be able to communicate and pass information on from one way to another. And we should know, or you should know, when studying the cell last year, that they are these ion channels all around the outside of each cell, and they're constantly opening and closing, and they're letting certain substances in and certain substances out, hence the name semi-permeable. Next one. Okay, so in order for the transfer basically of information from one point to another in the nervous system, the action potential needs to be conducted down the axon. And it's almost, if you think of a burning fuse, so a long string or whatever, and you light the bottom of that string and then it travels up the string, the burning fuse. Think of it like that. So it's conducted basically that way from one end to the other. So when the axon's depolarized to reach a specific threshold voltage, the voltage gate in sodium channel opens and the action potential is initiated. So remember, the sodium rushes in. So we do need sodium in our diets for this to occur. We don't want too much because that leads to, blood pressure, bad blood pressure and heart, but we do need an amount of sodium for this to happen. So the influx of the positive charge actually depolarizes a small segment of the membrane just before it reaches a threshold, and then an action potential is actually generated there, and it works its way down the axon. Okay, so down the axon through there until it reaches the axon terminal. Whee! And then there's a synaptic transmission, which we established happens there. And that is how it's passed from one to the other. One neuron to the other, sorry. Okay, so each of these neurons are covered in something called myelin. And this myelin actually helps to carry the information really quickly, basically. So it's an insulator as well, and it facilitates the flow, the current flow down the inside of the axon. So if it's got more myelin, that's going to affect the speed of information that's passed down that neuron as opposed to one that doesn't have as much myelin. So it's all to do with the current flow and how much information is actually taken down. And the last one here, where our electrical synapses happen, and I'm just showing this diagram here, it's actually called a gap junction. So the channel ions there, okay, pass directly from the cytoplasm. So remember the cytoplasm, which is inside the cell, yeah, and one cell, basically it passes directly from one cell to the cytoplasm of another. So those protein molecules, if we go all the way back, hang on, where do I have to go? Oh, here, so these protein receptors here that we looked at near the start, okay, those ones there, the proteins, are basically what these gap junctions are here. So it allows the electrical signal, so just say we've got the other neuron here, it passes the information down through those protein receptors, which are these gap junctions. It passes through and straight into the cytoplasm. It will then carry that information and continue it on to another cell. So that information will go out of that cell, through the synapse, into, or through the synapse, which is those receptor proteins, and into a new cell. So I don't have very much time left in this one, but it's about to cut me off. So that's basically how we get information down each of the cells, so through those electrical synapses. Okay, thank you for listening.